the presidency that almost collapsed overnight. It didn't happen with gunfire or crowds in the streets. It happened quietly, behind locked doors, while the nation slept. By morning, the presidency itself was closer to collapse than most Americans would ever realize. There was no visible rupture, no dramatic confrontation broadcast to the world. The danger was internal, structural, and almost entirely hidden from public view. The warning signs were there long before that night arrived. Authority had been strained. Trust had thinned. Decisions that once carried weight were suddenly questioned, delayed, or ignored. The office still existed, but its power was no longer absolute. What had once been automatic deference from institutions and allies had quietly eroded into something conditional, something that required constant reinforcement rather than simple expectation. To understand how the presidency nearly collapsed overnight, we have to return to a moment when legitimacy began to fracture, not through rebellion, but through doubt. The kind of doubt that spreads silently, eroding confidence before anyone admits it exists. It moved through back channels, private conversations, and unspoken hesitations. It was not the doubt of enemies. It was the doubt of those who were supposed to be loyal. Inside the White House, tension had become constant. Advisors disagreed not just on policy, but on whether the presidency could still enforce its will. Orders were issued cautiously. Language softened. Every move was measured against the fear of backlash. The atmosphere was one of chronic uncertainty, where confidence had to be performed rather than felt, and where every directive carried the unspoken question of whether it would actually be followed. What made this moment dangerous wasn't chaos. It was hesitation. When authority hesitates long enough, others begin to test it. Institutions push boundaries. Allies wait. Opponents probe for weakness. Hesitation, in a system built on presumption of decisive power, functions as an invitation for others to recalculate their own positions and loyalties. That night, those pressures converged. A decision had to be made quickly, with incomplete information and no guarantee of compliance. The presidency faced a choice it was never meant to confront: act decisively and risk exposure, or delay and risk irrelevance. The stakes extended beyond the immediate situation. Whatever happened in the next few hours would set a precedent, not just for the current administration, but for the office itself. Either path carried consequences that could permanently alter the office. And as midnight passed, one truth became unavoidable. If the presidency failed to assert itself before dawn, it might not recover authority at all. What happened next would determine whether the office survived the night or lost its grip forever. As the hours ticked past midnight, the presidency found itself operating without certainty. Messages went unanswered. Assurances fell flat. The usual mechanisms of control, directives, influence, expectation, no longer guaranteed compliance. Inside the administration, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to alarm. Advisors began asking questions that rarely surface in power. What if the order is ignored? What if authority fails in real time? What happens when the presidency speaks and no one listens? These were not hypothetical exercises. They were operational realities demanding immediate answers in a situation where no playbook existed. This was not a theoretical crisis. Signals from across the system suggested slippage. Agencies hesitated. Partners delayed response. The assumption that the presidency could compel action simply by commanding it was breaking down. The machinery of governance, which depends on the shared belief that presidential directives will be executed, was revealing its dependence on that belief rather than on any mechanical guarantee. What made the situation especially volatile was how invisible it remained to the public. The nation slept, unaware that the office designed to anchor stability was facing resistance not from enemies, but from uncertainty. The gap between the public image of presidential authority and the private reality of that moment was enormous, and that gap itself was part of the danger. Every option now carried risk. Force would expose weakness if it failed. Silence would confirm it. Negotiation took time that no longer existed. The presidency was running out of safe moves. The window for action was narrowing with every passing hour, and the cost of inaction was rising faster than the cost of any single decision. This is the moment history rarely records. The point where authority doesn't collapse, but flickers. The danger wasn't overthrow. It was irrelevance. And once power becomes optional, restoring it is far more difficult than anyone expects. The question facing the presidency wasn't how to win. It was whether anyone would still follow by morning. As dawn approached, the presidency made its move. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. A narrow action designed to test whether authority still held. The choice was calibrated to minimize exposure while maximizing the chance of compliance. A careful calculation born from the awareness that failure will be far more damaging than hesitation. The response came slowly at first, then unevenly. Some complied, others waited, a few pushed back. It wasn't defiance, it was hesitation. And hesitation was enough to confirm the fear that power was no longer absolute. The uneven response revealed something that could not be unseen. Authority was functioning, but only partially, and only where individual relationships or institutional habits still held firm. Inside the White House, the implications were immediate. If compliance could no longer be assumed, every future decision would carry new risk. The presidency could still act, but it could no longer rely on momentum alone. The comfortable assumption that the office carried inherent force had been replaced by the uncomfortable reality that force had to be negotiated each time it was exercised. What followed was improvisation. Back channels activated. Personal relationships replaced formal commands. Influence had to be rebuilt manually, call by call, assurance by assurance. The presidency operated not as an institution issuing orders from above, but as a network of individual conversations. Each one carefully managed to restore the sense of shared purpose that had fractured during the night. This was not governance as designed. It was governance by persuasion under pressure. The office survived the night, but something had been lost. Authority had revealed its limits, and limits, once exposed, are difficult to hide again. The knowledge that the system could hesitate, that compliance could stall, that the presidency could issue a directive and receive silence in return. That knowledge changed the internal calculus of power permanently. By sunrise, the crisis had stabilized, but not resolved. The presidency stood, but it stood differently. More cautious, more aware, less certain of its reach. The collapse didn't happen, but the near collapse changed everything. Because from that night forward, the presidency would never again assume obedience. It would have to earn it. By the time the sun rose, the nation remained unaware of how close the presidency had come to losing its grip. There were no headlines announcing failure, no speeches admitting fragility. On the surface, everything looked intact. The gap between public perception and internal reality had never been wider, and that gap itself became a defining feature of how the administration would operate going forward. But inside the system, the lesson was permanent. Authority had not collapsed, it had been tested, and the test revealed something no president ever wants to learn. Power only exists as long as others believe in it. Once belief wavers, commands become requests, orders become negotiations. The entire architecture of executive authority, which appears so solid from the outside, depends on a shared understanding that can erode without warning. From that night on, the presidency carried a new awareness. Every decision was measured not just by legality, but by likelihood of compliance. Influence mattered more than instruction. Credibility mattered more than force. The office survived, but innocence was gone. Future presidents would inherit this version of power. Quieter, more conditional, more dependent on persuasion than assumption. The presidency had not fallen, but it had changed shape. The contours of the office, what had seemed fixed and permanent, had been revealed as something more fluid and more fragile than anyone outside that room would ever fully appreciate. History often focuses on moments when power is seized or expanded. It rarely examines moments when power almost slipped away and had to be rebuilt in silence. This was one of those moments, because collapse doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, and the leaders who hear it never forget how close they came to losing everything. Subscribe to join the journey.